Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm really honored to have our next guest here, Miss Stacey Abrams, and it's really a good day for Indian country, so thank you. Before we start, you know, I kind of like know you a little bit, but I know your sister, your dad, I met your brother, and one of the things I wanted to start out with is to ask you a question is, you have an amazing family, and how did their influence, your mom and your dad, get you to where you are today and why you're doing what you're doing?
Thank you so much, OJ. For me, my parents are extraordinary people who are originally from Mississippi. We grew up on the edge of poverty. Sometimes we peered over the edge a little far for my taste, but we were working poor. But my parents raised us with 3 jobs. They said, go to church, go to school, and take care of each other. Go to church because they wanted us to be grounded in a faith and an ethic that was larger than ourselves. They wanted us to understand that it was our job to use that faith to protect and never to strike others down. They said, go to school because they knew education was a passport, that those who had access to education often had more opportunities. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was the strongest predictor of success. And they said, take care of each other, because they understood that no matter how little we had, there was someone with less, and your job was to serve that person. My father, who you've met, was more succinct. He would say, having nothing is not an excuse for doing nothing. And so in our family, the work ethic wasn't just about what do you do to make a living, it's what do you do to make quality of life better for those around you. So we would volunteer, and we would protest, and we would get engaged, because the notion of taking care of each other was larger than just the 6 brothers and the 5 siblings or 6 siblings that we have. It was about the community we were a part of, the world that we were a part of. And for me, that is one of the reasons today is so important, because I think there is a symbiosis in this notion that we must take care of one another. And that's really what guides the work that I do, whether it's running for office or starting nonprofits or even the businesses I start. They're all grounded in the responsibility to take care of each other.
Thank you. And really, I'm glad to hear those words, because what you described is Indian country. Family, community, we're all related. We say Midakiapi. We're all related, so I really appreciate that. But I'm going to turn it over to the panel now, but one of the things I wanted to tell you is the conversations that I had with your father were probably the best conversations I have had with anybody, so tell him hi.
I will, but I'm sure half of those conversations are not repeatable.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you and good afternoon. My name is Shannon Holsey, and I am the president of my tribal nation, and we are located in Wisconsin. However, our citizens are represented. There are 574 federally recognized tribes throughout the United States, and our citizens are represented all over the world, including Georgia. So I really appreciate your sentiment about equality and unity. And you know, I think when we can look around and start to see all of us instead of some of us, I think then that is when things start to change, especially as it relates. One of my all-time favorite things as it relates to those things is the oppressor would not be so strong if he did not have accomplices among the oppressed. And what it means by that is we all have a civic duty to be engaged and to vote, because representation, especially diverse representation, really truly does matter in terms of how we look at things. My former tribal president used to say, no decisions about us without us. And I think that's exactly right in terms of how we are moving and navigating this world, because we know with the 2020 census, and you talked about it here in Georgia, about there is going to be the minority that becomes the majority, right? And it isn't about a moment, it's about a movement. And we know the majority also consists of people of color and women and people from all various backgrounds. So, and you know, since time immemorial, if you've ever come from an oppressed community, and indigenous communities are no exception, you would agree that that representation and that access to the systematic barriers that exist in our communities are something that we haven't been able to successfully as people of color, or just generally speaking, creating allies to move that needle. So there's parity. And access to health care is one of those things. And I think that's a human right. Access to health care and proper education and all of those things are human rights. So with that said, Medicaid is critically important, especially to people who are from poor communities that don't have access to affordable health care. So with that said, could you tell us or expand on the expansion of Medicaid in the state of Georgia, and with that, what difference could it make in communities of color, and what outcomes do you think or you would hope that it would result in?
Thank you. And I'm going to start my answer by reflecting on one piece of what you said, which is the question of identity. There are those who would argue that identity in politics is somehow divisive, but I believe it's actually the only path to inclusive and expansive policy. If you don't understand the challenges a community faces, how can you solve the problem? And so in the state of Georgia, we know that we have 1.4 million people who currently do not hold health insurance. And in the United States, health insurance is the way you access regular care. If you cannot pay for it out of pocket, you need insurance. We've organized our employment system around it. The United States is, if not unique, then it's certainly singular in its dependence on employer-based health care. If you do not have employer-based health care or the financial means to pay for it out of pocket, you're often reliant on government-provided health care. Well, in the gap in Georgia and across the country are people who can neither afford it but are considered too wealthy to receive it. And in Georgia, that's 1.4 million people who have no insurance, 500,000 to 600,000 of whom would receive health insurance if we expanded Medicaid. What is troubling about the state of Georgia's posture is that we're one of only 12 states that refuse to expand Medicaid. And by doing so, we are rejecting federal funds that we've paid into. To date, Georgia has rejected $30 billion, that's billion with a B, $30 billion in funding that could have paid for access to health care in the state. Instead, we have watched 14 hospitals shut down. We have lost lives. We have lost thousands of jobs. And in a little more than a month, we will lose a level 1 trauma center, which means that if you are in a major accident in the metropolitan Atlanta area, which is 57% of our population, God help you, because you won't be able, if you get turned away from Grady Hospital, if you're near the Tennessee border, you'll have to go all the way to Macon, Georgia to get help. The reason Medicaid expansion is so critical is that the 14 hospitals we've lost are largely in rural communities, often rural communities inhabited by, if not members of Indian country, then inhabited by communities that have been disproportionately disadvantaged. We know that Native Americans in Georgia, their number one health risk is heart disease. But heart disease is also one of the illnesses that with regular preventative care could save and expand lives. And so for me, this is a matter of urgency, but it's also a matter of logic. It would draw down $3.5 billion every single year. We could save lives, create 64,000 jobs, and many of those jobs would be located in the very communities where people currently don't have insurance. So you're not just giving them insurance, you're also giving them a lifeline towards economic prosperity. All of these things come together, and the way I will tie it all is that right now, law enforcement is the number one provider of mental health care in the state of Georgia. But we know that for Native Americans, the challenges of mental health are exacerbated by the lack of access and the lack of resources. We could address those issues, and that the consequence, and it's true in the Black community as well, the consequence is often substance abuse, substance dependency, or suicide. And so those mental health challenges could be addressed if we expanded Medicaid, because when you draw down those dollars can be equally spent on physical health and mental health. And the refusal to expand Medicaid is a gross, callous, and mean-spirited decision by the current governor of the state, because he does not believe that people should be entitled to that help. That is just a fundamental moral disagreement that we have, but it is also not grounded in partisanship, because of the states that have expanded Medicaid, Republicans have done it, Democrats have done it, citizens have done it, and now it is time for Georgia to do it.
Okay, I'd like to talk about law. The new law that was passed on voting. if you become the governor, how can you help us with that? Because most people don't have, in my area, don't have good Wi-Fi. They do not have decent computers, if they have a computer. They will not have a printer in their home. And they will have to have all of this in order to do their voting by mail. So how can you help us be able to do something different with the laws?
So to expand on this a bit, SB 202 is the voter suppression law passed by the governor of Georgia in 2021, and I'm using his words, not my own. It was designed in response to his frustration with the results of the 2020 and 2021 elections. The only results he could be frustrated by was the loss that his party enjoyed, because he, using his own words, says that there was no fraud. There was no bad action. So the only frustration that could have precipitated these laws was frustration with who participated. Voter suppression at its core is about denying access to certain communities using the power of the state. That's what suppression is. It does not mean you stop everyone from voting. It means you target certain communities to lessen their likelihood of voting through either registration, whether they can register and stay on the rolls, whether they can cast a ballot, and whether that ballot gets counted. And so to the chief's point, one of the provisions of this 86-page bill was the decision to make it more difficult to vote by mail, because there was a disproportionate number of people of color who successfully used vote by mail in the 2020 and 2021 elections. And so instead of being able to receive an application that's pre-filled, you just sign it, send it back, or being able to go online and quickly file your request for a ballot, they changed the law to say that you have to have voter ID to use an absentee ballot. You have to print it out, use what's called a wet signature, meaning you have to print it out, sign it, scan it, and send it back, or you have to go to your local elections office if you know where it is and if it's open on the day you can get there. That once you do so, you cannot receive a ballot before October 10th. And that means that if you were going to be out of town, which is why you were applying for an absentee ballot in the first place, if you aren't there to receive it, you will not be permitted to vote in the state of Georgia. You have to apply for the ballot you can't apply more than 78 days before the election, but not fewer than 11 days. And if you know what those dates are on your calendar, congratulations to you, you should play the lottery. But for the rest of Georgia, this is an intentional impediment to participation. And I know there have been other conversations, so I'll move to the answer. The answer is you need a governor who actually believes in voter access and believes that the right to vote is sacred. I do. I have made this my life's work. Regardless of whether I'm in office or out, I am always working on expanding access to the right to vote, because it is the cornerstone of our democracy. And democracy is the only way we achieve the solutions and the access that we need for the lives that we deserve. And so as governor, I will work to mitigate the harm that has been imposed by the state, one of which would be changing how the state can send information out, because while it precludes private groups from doing so, there's no such impediment on the state. 2, I would make certain that we make available through mobile units access to the very materials that you need to participate. And then 3, I'm going to make certain we reach into communities that are disproportionately harmed, including the Native American community, to engage in a very visceral and substantive level on why it matters. Because what voter suppression does, in addition to blocking you from participation, it convinces you that your voice doesn't matter. And it's that psychic effect that has long-term implications, because when families don't vote, progeny doesn't vote. When progeny doesn't vote, communities don't vote. And when that happens, communities don't receive service. And my mission is to connect the dots between the act of democracy and the act of access. And when we connect those two pieces, as governor, I will be doing my job.
Patu Washte, my name is Yanaja Halone Wolf. I am a proud Ogallala Lakota tribal member and Black. And I always say I feel like I'm the oppressed under the oppressed, being Native American and Black. I'm a national community organizer and an activist. My sister, Annie Poorbear from Pine Ridge Reservation, she basically went in front of a friend of hers that was being sex trafficked and human trafficked, and she was shot and killed and murdered. With that, it was, if we had the resources and the attention around missing and murdered Indigenous women, I believe that could have been preventable. As if you're elected as governor, what is your plans, especially in Georgia, around human trafficking and sex trafficking, not only all four directions of our people, but specifically around Black and Indigenous women and men and children?
We know that human trafficking is a scourge across our nation, but is exacerbated in Georgia because we have 4 of the most highly trafficked roadways, 85, 75, I-20, and then 65. Actually, and you add what's running along the coast. So we have multiple points of entry. We have the Savannah port, the Atlanta airport, regional airports, and we are a population of nearly 11 million people, but we're the single largest landmass state east of the Mississippi. Florida has more water, but we've got more land. And so the reason this matters is that it's not only about the trafficking, it is the ease with which trafficking can happen. It is the paucity of resources invested in our law enforcement to address it. It is the broken nature of our public health infrastructure. It is the lack of access to information and to the internet, which is one of the ways many victims of human trafficking can send up an alert that they are being harmed. Georgia has failed to make progress on all of those fronts. And in my mind, one of the key responsibilities is to make sure that we reduce the cost on law enforcement so we can increase their participation and protection. In Georgia, because we won't expand Medicaid, our law enforcement is the #1 provider of mental health services. That means they're arresting people for being sick, not dangerous. And if we could divert those funds from basically arresting people for mental illness and instead pour those dollars into issues like human trafficking, we can increase the likelihood that law enforcement can be responsive and attentive. The other challenge there is that 90% of law enforcement is actually performed by local law enforcement. They are disproportionately underpaid once you're outside of the major metro areas. They do not have the training, they do not have the resources, and they have not been given the directive that that has to be one of their primary responsibilities. And then you layer on top of it the lack of recruitment. One of the best ways to help a population is identity, making certain that people involved in the investigation, involved in the conversation, understand what, I mean, to your point, it's not, you can't make decisions about us without us. That should also include the issue of human trafficking. Having more young women and young men and former victims of trafficking involved in policymaking. I served in the legislature for 11 years. I can tell you, I met one victim of human trafficking who was invited to the Capitol to have the conversation. And it was a critical conversation that changed how we were approaching a piece of law. But there has to be more access and more understanding. In addition, once someone is saved from, or we provide they save themselves typically, there has to be long-term investment in their needs. Medicaid expansion, again, getting immediate access to health care because of the age, making certain they have immediate access to education and to mental health care and supportive services, making sure they have access to housing. Georgia has a housing crisis, an affordable housing crisis, where we're missing at least 207,000 affordable units, and that's not including the fact that we have a number of people who are staying in extended stay hotels, many of whom are victims of human trafficking, and that is how they're kept off the radar. And so we have to have a holistic approach to this conversation, and my intention is to use a portion of the $5 billion surplus that Georgia currently has and use those dollars not to provide tax rebates to wealthy Georgians, which is the intention of the current governor, but to instead invest it in these critical foundational issues that help serve all communities. And to your point about the intersection of being both Indigenous and Black, we know that in Georgia that is not uncommon, but the attention is almost non-existent. And I will come into office with the very real lens of thinking about how we serve these populations by bringing these populations into the conversation to build the policies.
Well, thank you, Leader Abrams. And I guess before we end, we want to give you an opportunity to talk basically about, again, your plans and how you are going to help Georgia and why they should vote for you.
Thank you. And thank you again for having me. Thank you. I'm sitting next to my friend, Chief McCormick. I've actually had a chance to visit Wiggum. She didn't feed me as much as I'd hoped for, but she promised she would next time I was there. It was my fault. I came on the day before they were planning a major event, so I needed to send my RSVP a little earlier. But I say that to say this. I know that in the region of the state where Chief McCormick is doing her work, we have an infrastructure issue where we have too many communities that are on septic systems instead of sewer systems, and those septic systems have gone untouched and unmitigated for years. I intend to be a governor who actually uses the resources coming into the state for infrastructure to serve and support those communities. We know that on the other side of the state in McIntyre, Georgia, the mayor there had to beg for years. She was in a long line of mayors who for 30 years begged for $6 million to simply fix their sewer system, to create a sewer system. It took federal action to achieve that. The state has the resources, but if we do not, we will be in the same position that we have watched assail Mississippi and the city of Jackson, only it's going to happen in multiple communities across this state. As governor, I will give priority to fixing the actual infrastructure of our state. But more important than infrastructure are the people here. That is why my plan is to invest in education by raising the salaries of our teachers to a starting salary of $50,000 with $11,000 raises for all educators and increases for educational support personnel, including cafeteria workers and bus drivers. I want to make certain we are addressing the affordable housing crisis. Right now, the current governor has $3 million in the Housing Trust Fund. I want to increase that to $32 million. I want it to be a 10x investment to start. I want to make certain we expand Medicaid. It will cost us roughly $300 million to start, but for every dollar we put in, we will draw down $9, and we will bring $3.5 billion every year to the state. By doing that, we will tackle health care, public service, and we can tackle the issue of jobs. I want to create small business investment funds because I know that among the Native community, as well as Black community and communities across the state, this is a governor who has spent most of his money big game hunting, bringing in big companies, but doing very little for the small businesses on the ground. I want to invest in those businesses, make sure they have access to resources, including farming, because you shouldn't have to navigate the USDA for a family farm. And these are things we can do because we have the money. And that, if you hear nothing else, hear this. Georgia has a once-in-a-generation opportunity with a $5 billion surplus to stop putting Band-Aids on our bullet holes. We can start fixing our problems. Rather than using that analogy, let's use this one. Georgia is a house where the roof leaks and the basement floods, and we keep patching the roof and bailing out the basement. I want to replace the roof and fix the plumbing. Make sure we grade the outside so that we can actually be safe and secure. If we make those investments, we can do everything else we need to do without increasing taxes. And we can do all of this because we've already paid in. We just need to bring our money home and spend our money wisely. And whether you are Native American or a Georgian who simply understands that this conversation lifts us all up, I'm just grateful for the opportunity to be here, to share this conversation, to share this space, and to share my promise as the next governor of Georgia. I intend to serve one Georgia where we all can thrive. Thank you all so much.
Wopila, thank you very much.